Hi, I'm Sarah Loudon from Total Health Conferencing, and this is another podcast episode of Inspired. Tonight we are with Dr. Hope Rugo, professor in the Department of Medicine and the director of breast cancer at the University of California, San Francisco. And as always, our Inspired interviews really are to get a more intimate look at who we are working together with and get to know them a little bit more. So Hope, it's a first name interview because we kind of like to beam into the cars or the living rooms of where everyone is. And I would like to dive right in starting by asking you to tell us a little bit about where you grew up and maybe a little bit about your family in terms of brothers and sisters, what your mom and dad did, etc.
Well, it's great, Sarah, and thanks so much for inviting me to be interviewed and for doing actually this whole program series, which I think is so nice and gives such a personal touch to what we do and to oncology. I grew up in Massachusetts, largely born in Virginia when my father was in the military, but really from all of my memory part of life is from growing up in Massachusetts. And then I went on to college at Tufts University before I went on to medical school at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'll talk more about what happened after that in a moment. But I was the middle child of three children. I have an older brother who's a lawyer and lives in St. Louis, and a younger brother who, strangely enough, also lives in St. Louis because they went to college in the same place, and who works on a therapy sort of area. They see each other quite frequently, but I'm the one who's far away on the West Coast. My father had a PhD in biophysics and worked in that field, but I think that his life was really shaped, as was true of my husband's father, by working in World War II and being in the Korean War, and really changed their complete perspective. And I think they brought a lot of that to our growing up in our family life in terms of our passions and what we put energy into doing. Then my mother, interestingly, went to Radcliffe at the time and got a degree in art history or something, I don't know. And she worked in museums, but she didn't do she didn't work for very long, and had three kids. And then when I was in high school, she went back to school and learned how to teach dyslexic children English.
Wow.
She had always been so fascinated with English. She read the dictionary for fun as a kid, and so she became dean. It's just an older profession. She became dean of the school that she worked in near where we grew up in Massachusetts, and president of the New England branch of the Orton Society. And that was really a great profession for her. With, I think, a lot of positive feedback, and she did really well in it. It was exciting for her.
How old were you guys when she decided to kind of go back to school and almost start this second life with the things she was interested in?
I think that I was in high school. So my brother's 3 years older than me, must have been towards the end of high school, and my younger brother in higher grade school, but it wasn't very far away from us, and we grew up in a little town in Massachusetts, so it wasn't like people were going far.
Right. But that's still so it's kind of like for this to follow your dreams at really any time in your life, and it almost seems as though she did all of the things she was going to do and then decided, I have this real interest in this real passion in this thing, and I'm going to go for it.
Yeah, it was really funny because she had last been in school so long ago. My mother's born in 1923, right? And she got a master's in fine arts, so she had a higher degree. But when she went to go to school, she didn't have anything to show, right, for decades and decades. So she brought her Phi Beta Kappa key, which was very popular with her. I just remember that being such an important thing for her in getting into this program, which is very competitive. And she was always a good student. So it was a great thing to see her develop that area of her life. And I think very encouraging because my parents were, although they did, I was born a long time ago. It was a different world. We had, girls had to wear dresses to school. And I remember that when it was really snowy in Massachusetts, we would wear pants under our dresses, and then we had to take them off before we could go to class. So you say, wow, that was a long time ago.
No, but it just seems, it's so funny because as we go along in this interview, I'm going to ask you, one of my questions was, how have things evolved for women in medicine since you went to medical school? But let's start with medical school. So when did you know that you wanted to be a doctor?
Well, that's the funny thing is that from very young, I had this idea that I wanted to be a doctor, which I think to my parents seemed like one of those, kid dreams. I think when I was 5, I said, I want to have a job, and then the next thing was my father was a biophysicist, so I wanted to have a chemistry set. So I saved up my green stamps from the gas stations, which we had then, which no one on the call will have know anything about, but S&H green stamps in our little book. And from Sears, I got a chemistry set where you could set various things on fire, And then somehow around, it was a little older, maybe under 10 though still, I had the idea that if you were doing chemistry, you were actually sitting in a lab, never seeing anybody. And and watching the doctors on television, I thought, wow, this is really cool. I want to be a doctor when I grow up. And I remember my mother saying, if you have a profession like that, you'll never have a family, right? Then you won't get married and have a family. But, I never believed anything like that. So, so I was very young when I wanted to be a doctor.
And as you grew up, did it change? We all kind of feel like we want to be something when we're young, and then as we experience other things, or was it pretty consistent all along? You knew you wanted to do this?
Well, luckily, I didn't want to be an astronaut or something that, you have all sorts of criteria that knock you out, being a physician really just has to do with working really, really hard, to get there. But, it's an interesting thing. That's not anything I ever doubted. I knew I wanted to be a physician, and I started volunteering in our local hospital in Massachusetts, a little local regional hospital, and worked in the school for people who had genetic diseases like Tay-Sachs in the summers. And, every chance I had, I worked at something like that. And I always thought it was really interesting. One of the things I always have thought about physicians is that, clinician physicians are a little nosy, right? I mean, they see something and they want to know what's wrong, what caused that. And that was one of the real excitements I had when I started volunteering was, what is wrong? What's causing that? What's the mechanism of making that? And I didn't even know, there wasn't something like translational, biology then or anything, but it was really just a sense of wanting to know what was wrong, and also having a real passion for communicating with people. And I mean, it sounds so trite, but helping people, I always had this idea of fixing problems. So I didn't ever really change my mind.
That's amazing. And as you are going through medical school, was it, I've said this in a couple of podcasts that I think it's last year, we had the first class where the majority of incoming medical school students were women. Do you see there has been these kind of major or maybe even incremental shifts in a balance of women in medicine kind of emerging as everything from professors to deans to researchers over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been a huge shift. And you ask about professors and deans, et cetera. I think the shift in the higher levels has been much more subtle. Mm-hmm. The number of women in the medical school classes is very different. We could count on one hand the women in my medical school class, but I have to say, maybe two hands. We already were much more than what had been in the past. Yeah. And people were very accepting of women being in medicine, but there was a sense, I remember one of my classmates got engaged, and then she said, well, she was going to change to go into dermatology, no strike against dermatology, because she needed to have time to take care of her husband and her family, So now I can't imagine somebody actually saying that to me at UCSF Medical School, but, I think there was still the sense that, you still had all those standard female responsibilities, and you were going to do medicine alongside, and there was a sense of what might be the best careers for women versus not. But I think that when I was in medical school, already those barriers were being broken and people were really looking beyond the traditional roles and doing more and more. But it's interesting to me, I mean, when I started on faculty at UCSF 30 years ago, there were, women, there was one other woman in the program who subsequently left. Now women are big in the program and hold big roles, of responsibility. For example, woman ran our fellowship program, a woman runs our quality assurance, one of our faculty members, and these are women in their early 40s. I mean, they're not the, old people. And she ran all of our COVID response from a medical oncology standpoint. And, so we're really seeing, and also the women across all divisions have done amazing work in research and clinical programs. So I think, during my time at UCSF, it's been an enormous shift.
Yeah. It's really encouraging to see. But getting back to medical school and kind of picking your specialty, you didn't start off in breast oncology. So maybe walk us through what your original interest was and then how you shifted to get into breast oncology care.
Well, it's a little circuitous, but I think my interests were always aligned. It was where I was putting my interests that changed a little bit over time and understanding what was the best. Some people figure it out earlier on, and it took me a little longer. So, in medical school, my whole idea was I was going to save the world. The idea of being an epidemiology intelligence officer was very interesting to me through the CDC, where you would go out and deal with, pandemics and infectious disease. I mean, it's so funny to think about where we are now, but that's what my whole idea was of what I wanted to do. And a lot of the volunteering that I did was in part related to going to rural areas and trying to figure out what was going on. I volunteered for the Tennessee Brown Lung Association one summer and took a bus down to rural Tennessee and worked there. And, a lot of different interesting areas. But I actually had gone to medical school on a National Health Service Corps award because it was $6,000 a year was more than what we had. And that was tuition at University of Pennsylvania when I started. Mm-hmm. So I got 2 years of support from the National Health Service Corps, which was hugely helpful. But with that 2 years, you commit to working in a health manpower shortage area for that number of years after you finish your training. And you could only train in specific areas. So for example, you couldn't have done training in surgery because that wasn't an identified need. You could do internal medicine. There wasn't any family practice then. So I did my residency and training, but in between, I actually went to Asia with the Asia Foundation and the Henry Luce Foundation. So, again, I had always wanted to go out and, fix things. And, I still love to travel, not that we're doing it now. But I had applied for a number of programs through the University of Pennsylvania because they have a big undergraduate campus. And I had got 2 fellowships. One was from the Henry Luce Foundation, and one was to study public health in England at the London School of Tropical Hygiene. But in the end, I took the Asia program because it was so different. And so they actually sent at the time 15 Americans to various places in Asia to work in their field for a year. So I went to the southernmost island of the Philippines, Mindanao, and I taught community health workers and worked within the small medical school there, traveled around. And so then when I came back, the question was, what was I going to do? And because of the National Health Service Corps, I did internal medicine and didn't have to really think about what I was going to do. At the time, I was still very focused in infectious disease. So then I went, I matched at UCSF, and in part, the reason why I put UCSF top on my match list was because I had just spent this year in Asia. My medical school class had graduated, so I spent another year with a class behind me, and I went to England and actually did work. I didn't get a master's in public health, but I worked in a couple of hospitals in London that next year. So I came to California because it seemed closer to Asia and more with what I was working in at the time. But in my residency, what I found was really interesting was, that infectious disease was absolutely fascinating, but you didn't follow the person, right? You take care of the problem and then they go away. But in oncology, we spent a lot of time, working on the oncology ward. You actually took care of the whole person. And the problem was more like a puzzle to solve, the infectious complications, all the issues that were going on at the time with patients who were hospitalized with transplants, et cetera. And I felt like in the end that was a whole body, like you could really take care of a patient. So I started thinking about oncology, but I still had this National Health Service Corps award, right? So at the time, the administration had changed, and the National Health Service Corps had a lot less resources, but I still had my requirement. So I remember the place that they were going to place me possibly was either Sitka, Alaska, where I was going to be doing pediatric. I mean, I trained in a tertiary care hospital in internal medicine. I was going to be doing pediatrics and OBGYN and things like that. Or I could go to Lubbock, Texas and work in a jail. So all of these were possibilities. And that I was on call at our county hospital as a second-year resident. And I got a call from the program director at the time in Hem-Onc saying, this was the first year of the match. We have a spot left. Do you want to be a Hem-Onc fellow? And it was 10 o'clock in the morning and I had 10 admissions. I said, well, how long do you need, for me to decide? He said, well, the next hour. I said, okay, I'll do it.
Well, facing Alaska or a jail in Lubbock, Texas, it might have felt a little bit like this might be a good third.
I was really interested in Hem-Onc, and I think, the issue was that I couldn't figure out the funding part for the National Health Service Corps. Right. But they gave me National Research Science Award funding for the 2 years. So that deferred my requirement. And then I paid back my service working at the university. Yeah. So I remember when I got that notice in paper, because it wasn't email then, that said I had paid back my debt, I kept it on the refrigerator for a year. Wow. Because it so much drove all of that. But it was really exciting. And so then when I finished my residency, I went right into the Hem-Onc fellowship. And you were mentioning how I got to breast cancer. And, I said it's a little circuitous because I went into the lab during my fellowship, which everybody did at that time. And I worked on, interestingly, cytokines and the immune system, and was really interested in, again, it was sort of going back to infectious disease, but looking at and in fact, I worked with a guy in an ID at Stanford and looking at cytokine response and the host immune response and trying to understand how the body responded to disease. And again, when I had a grant, so I was going to stay in the lab, and I was finishing my fellowship, and they had a spot that opened up on the faculty in bone marrow transplant. And they called me up and they said, do you want to take this position? I said, well, sure, why not? So I did bone marrow transplants for 9 years. But during that time, it was really exciting. I started our stem cell harvesting program, our unrelated donor program. We did transplants, the first transplants in myeloma. We were all involved in those different areas, and autologous transplants for leukemia. It was actually a fascinating time. I learned a lot about HLA and the immune system. And then, unfortunately, my mother, who had a 1 centimeter breast cancer, right before I left for Asia in 1982, 83, had developed metastatic disease to bone. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up taking care of her when I had my small children, my son and then my daughter. And she eventually died of her breast cancer that was hormone receptor positive and should never have come back. And so, I loved hematology. It was really great. But, I started thinking a lot about what I wanted to do and where I wanted to spend my energy and time in my career. And, I looked at myeloma, which I was working on at the time, which was 4% of all cancers, incredibly important. And I looked at breast cancer, 1 in 8 women got breast cancer then too. And again, I was so fortunate that one of my colleagues went into industry. So I applied for that job in breast oncology and made a lateral move, and I've never looked back. That was 21 years ago, and it was the best career move I made.
It's not just the best career move you made, probably personally, but I can't imagine an environment of breast cancer absent of Hope Rugo's contributions. I mean, I really can't, and I'm sure our listeners feel the same way. It seems like you were you always, from 5 years old, when you were like thinking about that chemistry set and collecting the stamps and all those things, you were always searching for, it was like you were always letting curiosity lead you. And I love that even later on, it's always been like that curiosity that's kind of brought you to making these decisions. And I think that that's probably what makes you such a great researcher because you're still always looking for those answers. Like, why is it happening? What can we do to influence the fact that it's happening? So, this year at the ASCO, our cancer meeting, for those who are listening who aren't providers, there's a national meeting every year that, tens of thousands of doctors learn the newest in data development. And Hope had some very exciting things. And Hope, I'd love for you to share maybe some of the exciting things you've been involved with since you made the move to breast cancer, and then specifically this year at ASCO.
Yeah, I mean, there have been so many things that I've been involved with over time that have been really exciting and fun. And I think, one of the amazing things that we do is interact with our colleagues internationally and interact with our patients, who are just an incredible group of people and make up the whole fabric of what we do. So the reason for everything that we do really goes back to our patients. But for me, a lot of the exciting areas were developing our own research studies, being involved from the ground level in our national neoadjuvant trial called I-SPY 2. And then some other really interesting things. So things that just came up off the cuff, getting the first scalp cooling device approved in the United States for preventing hair loss from chemotherapy, all based on a patient, really pushing me to try and prevent her hair loss in a long time ago now. And, that it was interesting that you could sort of just take an idea, cast around for a partner to work on it and come up with something that would really lead to a change. I know now there are 2 scalp cooling devices approved in the United States. Scalp cooling is available to people all across the United States in many centers, although we're still working on trying to get insurance to cover it more. And we're always working on improving this. One of the other areas that I worked on, which was kind of funny given the fact that I was always going to go out and do international, infectious disease work, was biosimilars. I've been very interested in access to care, and having the opportunity to work on the regulatory approval of the first trastuzumab biosimilar in the United States was also really exciting for me. And then lastly, I've always been interested in, how people manage and side effects and managing side effects and sort of weighing risk and benefit. And through that, I got really interested in toxicity management and safety. And through that, we developed a very simple steroid mouthwash to prevent everolimus stomatitis that's being used, got put onto the label based on our work in the SWISH trial. And people use it worldwide, and it essentially eliminated any severe stomatitis based on a really simple solution. We've been able to outline the timelines for certain toxicities, which has helped people think about ways to manage these toxicities. And we've developed some new ways to try and communicate management of toxicity in a more rapid fashion, and to, in fact, sort of track these through the I-SPY program, where I'm the safety officer along with a colleague from UC San Diego, Richard Swab. So I think that those are some of the really exciting areas that I've been able to work in terms of the clinical trials, but before ASCO this year. But more recently, over the last few years, the whole advent of immunotherapy felt like I was in some ways coming back home, because I had started in the lab and in bone marrow transplant, thinking about the host immune system and the immune response and how it benefited, how it could work together to eliminate illness, including cancer. So the whole idea of checkpoint inhibitors and understanding tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, all of the work that we've done in that area, and in Passion 130, where it was just an honor to participate in that trial and to be able to look at some of the biomarker data, and now most recently Keynote 355 with pembrolizumab, where we're still looking at additional data, and we'll see additional data in the future. I've been interested in what affects the majority of patients. Looking at cyclin-dependent kinase 4/6 inhibitors has been just, again, another honor to be able to participate. Our patients I have 3 patients who are 7 years out from starting on Paloma 2, the first phase 3 trial to start in the first line setting. I mean, who would have thought that such a thing could happen? Working in HER2 positive disease, where, we have patients who have survived, metastatic HER2 positive breast cancer, and they weren't when I started in breast oncology. So, just seeing the advances in treating brain mets, et cetera, very exciting to see. for me, continuing to look at different ways of trying to improve outcome and understand different patient responses based on prior treatment has been really interesting. At ASCO this year, I presented data from the first cohort of the BYLieve trial that looked at the PI3 kinase inhibitor alpelisib in patients who had developed progression of their cancer on CDK4/6 inhibitors and an aromatase inhibitor, and were treated with fulvestrant and alpelisib and had known PIK3CA mutations. That includes about 40% of breast cancer. And that's been also really interesting because it's a single arm trial, which I like when we have an approved drug, where we don't have to randomize patients. It seems like to me such a big ask of patients and such a big use of money and resources to randomize again if we know a drug already has effectiveness, although there are tremendous benefits of randomization in many settings. But in this trial with BYLieve, we used a really novel approach, which I think people have been looking at more and more, which is looking at a real world analysis.
Yeah.
So we actually got a group of patients from this Flatiron database who all had PIK3CA mutations and all had prior exposure to CDK4/6 inhibitors, and compared how long the disease was controlled or progression-free survival in the real world group versus the experimental group, and showed that there was continued effectiveness of alpelisib with fulvestrant in patients who'd received prior CDK4/6 inhibitors. The original trial that led to approval, only a tiny number of patients had received those agents, the CDK4/6 inhibitors, because the trial occurred before there was approval of those agents. So this really added to, I think, people's understanding and comfort. And we also saw that we could modify toxicity by understanding the timelines for toxicity, some data we just published this year. And also that by using oral non-sedating antihistamines, we could markedly reduce rash, which is a big issue. So we learned a lot from these analyses that I think will help to moderate toxicity and help patients to tolerate this treatment.
And do you see study designs like this becoming kind of marks of the future now that we're learning so much at a rate that really is unprecedented in all cancers, most cancers? Do you think that we have to get more creative in how we design trials? And do you think COVID has pushed us into thinking about things like redundancies and efficiencies and access and things like that that will lead to better trial design and greater access for adults on clinical trials?
It's a good question. I think that some things are going to stay, and for some things, I think our memory may be short. I think where I hope things will stay is the ability to do telemedicine visits when patients don't need to come in for an exam, get their laboratory studies done locally. Our patients have really, really appreciated that, with the, of course, caveat that if people have satellite internet, the communication can be difficult, which happens for some of our more rural patients. Maybe that'll change over the future too, that there'll be a lot of energy and effort put into trying to improve internet access for patients just for this purpose, to improve healthcare. Having meetings with, being able to learn more and having educational meetings where there is a component of telemedicine or, virtual meetings like this one, I think also is really exciting. Although I think all of my colleagues would agree that we're really pining for our in-person meetings. Really looking forward to that, and that in some ways having an in-person meeting allows us to have real-time communication and learn more and convey more. But I think that this will be a component of things. Maybe it'll make education even more accessible for people around the world, and that will be really important because that's how we improve patient care. We can do consults, for example, for patients in various places of the world using telemedicine. And that's another great thing that I hope will incorporate more and more due to COVID. For research trials, it's a whole nother issue. We've really been facing, if you're taking oral medications, maybe you could not come in all the time, right? You don't need an exam. Your disease is in your bones. You can't feel it, And in fact, there's not a lot we see on exam unless people have nodes or chest wall disease or big livers. We need the labs, we need to talk to them. But I have to say that in general, the sponsors for trials are very hesitant to have any of that happen. And we've had some trials that closed during the height of the pandemic that are opening now, where there were a lot of, guarantees that we have to make that we will see the patients in person. They will always come in person. They will always do the lab. So I think that the sponsors are very worried about the regulatory reaction to this. That having been said, we have one trial with an all oral regimen that we're still delivering by courier, and patients are coming in every other visit and doing telemedicine every other visit. I'd love to see that be incorporated more, but the only reason that we were allowed to do that is because these patients had already been on study for more than a year, and we really understood the safety completely. So, I think we're going to wait and see. I'm guessing that in the clinical research arena, that we won't remember much of it. It won't be part of our memory. But in clinical care, I hope that it is.
Yeah. It's sad because you think of cancer being, everybody's always trying to innovate to kind of reach the patient where they are more and more and more, no matter what. If you're like all the work you're talking about referencing toxicities, like, the goal isn't just cure cancer. The goal is to give a good quality of life while you're curing cancer. And I think it's sad because, the numbers of adults that join clinical trials are, somewhere less than 5%. And so little changes might be something that kind of spurs more people to have more remote access. And I'm sure that we are innovative enough to come up with ways to kind of still check all the regulatory boxes. But, it's interesting to hear that, we might have a short memory, but my hope is that, people like you and others can convince those rule makers that we can still do just as effective a job and maybe even better by considering some of the patient challenges in joining trials.
One thing I think that is helpful is that you can do an initial discussion of a trial now by telemedicine. So it may feel less of a trek for the patient and a little less threatening that they have their family can be there. So it's been an issue with COVID having people into clinic, and they can really learn about it and maybe decide and come in. We mostly have people who are doing neoadjuvant therapy come in because you want to examine them. But in other situations, we've done a lot of discussion of trials and possibilities for treatment by telemedicine for patients who are coming in for second opinions or consults. And maybe that'll help people a little bit in terms of better ways and, monitoring for clinical trials, et cetera, being able to use some kind of virtual monitoring, although we're still working out how that's going to happen, access to the electronic health record, how that works, and maintaining confidentiality. There's still a lot of interest in on-site monitoring. So we'll see. I mean, maybe this will lead gradually to bigger and bigger changes. It's interesting. We've talked about, what you can do, for example, if you could give subcutaneous trastuzumab and pertuzumab at home, Still people are very anxious about it, in terms of reimbursement and cost and how people can do the injection, et cetera. I think it will still be given in infusion centers and not at home unless insurance aren't going to pay for a nurse to go to the home every 3 weeks. So there's still a lot of adjusting that we're doing about what you can do at home versus not in terms of active therapy.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned some cases where you have, patients who have done very well, who are still part of, trials that started a very long time ago, and then patients who you've seen come out of therapies that weren't available and they're still living. Do you have a case maybe that sticks out in your mind of someone that just makes what you do so rewarding, knowing that, your intervention has impacted them so significantly?
The hardest thing about that, Sarah, is that there are so many.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful.
I think that it's really amazing when I think about the people where, I'm just so amazed at how well they're doing. Sometimes I'll have an afternoon where I see 3 or 4 of those people, and it's just so inspiring. And in some ways it re-energizes you, because we deal with a lot of tough situations too. But I think that it can really re-energize you. The patient who had a brain metastasis who NED without any disease, 10 years later. And I just took off the experimental therapy she was on with bevacizumab and lapatinib. A patient who went on a very early trial we did with Memorial, who had metastatic triple negative breast cancer. And for reasons I have no idea why, on bevacizumab and erlotinib, her disease went away, and it never came back again. So she's now long been off therapy. It's about 15 years, 18 years ago now, 16 years ago. And she was the only patient in a trial of 41 patients.
Wow.
And then, I have a number of other patients, the patients with triple negative disease who for some reason their disease went away, doing something, and it just didn't come back again. Now that we have immunotherapy, I have a couple of patients who, have no disease who started on immunotherapy trials, including one patient who started on this Keynote 86 cohort A, which was in the second or greater line, a young woman who started on single agent pembrolizumab. We weren't checking any PD-L1 or anything in that group, and we didn't have the data that responses were poorer, to the second or greater line, single agent pembro. She had triple negative disease with lung mets. What we do know now is that lung mets have more TILs and higher PD-L1 positivity than maybe liver. In any case, she started on therapy and with her lung mets that had progressed on capecitabine, and a young woman in her 40s. And then she went to Mexico about 4 months later. Lung lesions were markedly smaller, right? So I knew she was responding. But you don't know how long or what's going to happen. We had barely given immunotherapy at that time. And so she went to Mexico and she came back and she had a little diarrhea. And we're like, oh yeah, it's just traveler's diarrhea. Everybody had it. So then diarrhea got better with antibiotics. Then it got a lot worse. I was like, talked to my colleagues and, lung, and I think it was melanoma. And they said, oh, well, you better do a colonoscopy. So she had a little bit of colitis. And at the time you were supposed to stop therapy if you had colitis. But there was a phase 2 trial, not randomized. I talked to my colleagues who were running the study and said, look, this is so mild, I can just give her budesonide. Can I keep her on? And they said, well, it's up to you, whatever's in her best interest, it won't be a violation. So I kept her on. And 2 years later, we were supposed to stop treatment. I gradually tapered her off the budesonide, the side effects went away. And I said at 2 years, I don't want to really stop the pembro. And they were like, well, but you have to. So I got compassionate use pembro and put her on pembro, and it's now she's 4.5 years, still NAD, and went on budesonide one other time, has a little psoriasis, on and off, a little bit of diarrhea, but her kids have grown up. She had breast reconstruction. She said, oh, now I'm not going to die, I'm going to have reconstruction. She's working full time as a teacher now virtually. Yeah. And it is stories like that that just make you realize that you can make such a difference in a single person's life. And that's really exciting. And I think it gives all of us the passion for what we do every day. It has to drive what we do all the time.
Yeah. I love the balance between you seeing patients in clinic on that one-on-one, which is what kind of drove you into this, moving away from your original dreams of being, the epidemiology investigator.
Marching around picking up bugs.
But you still are impacting, with even things like the cold caps. It's so incredible when you're given something that you think you're going to lose, and it helps you kind of keep your faith and your hope and your spirit, all of those things. And so you balance that success in the clinic and then success still on these population things that you're involved with. So I love that you've been able to kind of keep that balance too, as you've moved forward in your pursuits. Hope, can you talk to us a little bit about, all of us went through this kind of whoosh in March when everything started shutting down, and someone like you who has clinic, who has research, who travels to speak from podium, who is involved in, so many things, all of a sudden now it's like you're home, it's telemedical visits, it's, let's figure out what's going on with this COVID. What have you learned about this season of your life that maybe things were moving very fast before, but this gave you an opportunity to see things in a little bit of slow motion? What have you learned about yourself in this time?
Well, it's interesting you say slow motion. I was just reflecting on, I don't think I've ever been as busy in my life. I mean, I think the issue of being able to do telemedicine visits anywhere and talk to people and give talks by, do talks by Zoom or other platforms and do virtual advisory boards, all of the things that are going on have really, and the sort of, small closing of clinical research, but keeping the critical studies open and then expanding again. There's been a million conference calls and I just sometimes I can't find a minute, except for in the middle of the night to close my notes, So it's been really, really busy. But of course, we haven't traveled. And in the beginning, it was kind of a novel thing for no travel. And now, again, all of my colleagues, around the world, it's like, we miss traveling a little, and maybe not so much, but we really, I do really miss seeing my colleagues and interacting with people around the world. That was really fun, and I think very gratifying, and I learned so much. I think that I'm hopeful that we'll get back to some of that in the next year or so, maybe in 2021, which is really what we're looking for, because I think that's an exciting thing to do. And I can't tell you how much I learned from my colleagues. So if you're sitting in a room listening to how people are interpreting data or talking about it outside of our major meetings, it really does help a lot. And also understanding different cultural approaches to disease and treatment, et cetera, have also been something I've been able to bring back to our own practice, which I think has been really, really good. But I've learned some also. I think it's, it is a time for reflection. There was a lot of fear early on, and, we were still marching into work, and, there hasn't been a clinic that I've missed. So we did more telemedicine, but we were still seeing our patients who needed chemotherapy. And it was scary. I think facing one's own fear about, in some ways, more about bringing home illness to your older husband who has asthma, things like that, or maybe bringing illness to your patients unknowingly, has been a very interesting experience that we never had before. So I've learned some about how to manage that. I also learned something which is really interesting, and you would never think about this, is that it was really quiet. It's sort of in the beginning in particular. It's a little bit more regular now, like our hub room is busier, although they made this COVID distancing, so it's a little messy, where everybody can sit and everything. But the medical assistants, a lot of times just me and the medical assistants, right? And the front office staff. And they were all taking a risk too. And they have a very different experience of coming to where they are, not seeing the patients and having the patients be so grateful and being alive, et cetera. They don't have as much of that experience, really. So I started going to, buying something, every week to bring in. So it had to be something that was individually packaged, fig bars, and I brought in little caramels, and, I would bring in something and I would hand it, everybody take it out and each week, I know my colleague who runs the clinical program overall would have lunch served once a week. And what's interesting to me is it brought together a collegiality with our staff that just didn't exist before. A conversation, a sharing that has been really cool. I mean, I think it's been great. And that was something I really didn't expect at all. We're very fortunate, and we have a little house in a rural part of Sonoma County in the wine country where we have a tiny little hobby vineyard. But we would go up there on the weekend, and when I wasn't working, I would, plant stuff. So, we had to go all around. Nobody was delivering plants, so we planted a lot of stuff. So it's been really fun, actually, to plant and see things grow. We put out bird feeders. I now can identify all sorts of birds, and I love taking photographs of birds. So now I have a whole group of photographs of all these different birds, including a hawk that had just picked up a mole, was flying off with the mole in its talons, and I think that learning those things that we can do too is really important, and has been a good part of this.
This whole time, I think, has, it's funny when you said you feel like you've never been busier. I think so many people can identify with that. I feel like I've never been busier, doing things like this. It's like you have to almost tap into what keeps you relevant, what keeps you sane, what makes you feel like because I run a live medical event company. And so everything turned upside down with this, but it made me start to realize, I get the picture. I remember you may or may not remember this. You came to dinner with me and my extended family in Puerto Rico.
Yes, I remember.
And it's like I got to see you in this way. And when I was thinking about doing something, through COVID and doing this kind of like inspired inside look, I was thinking not many people get the benefit like I do of seeing behind the podium, what the doctor's like and what makes them crazy and what makes them happy and like all these different things. And so I do feel like one of the things that you're talking about with that more meaningful connection with people, that is almost like it's almost like collateral from this. It wasn't ever, we sought that out, but at some point we started to miss connection. And so it was like we were doing things to make it deeper, making the time together more meaningful. And I love that that is something that you've brought out of it, and that your own team has gotten to experience that togetherness more, because you spend probably more time with them than you do in your home.
Yeah, and what was funny is that I realized that the staff, we don't sit in the same place, right? The medical assistants sit in a different place. And I realized that, that maybe I wasn't paying enough attention to them and knowing who they were. And, you're just running around all the time. And I thought, this is really a lesson in a lot of ways, slowing down and learning who people are and what they do and making them feel so appreciated. It's, it's incredibly important. And we just have to remember that all the time. So, we're always learning, and it's great to be able to learn from the people we work with, even on how we pay attention to people and interact.
Right. Well, I think that that's beautiful. And I do think that it's happening in pockets all around, because people are looking for, we're craving it, we're missing it. So I love that it's happening in clinic where, naturally it probably always should have happened, but the pace of things never allowed it to happen before. Well, you mentioned some personal interests. So you've got the little place in Sonoma, and you love planting, and now you've developed this newfound love for bird watching and photographing. What other things do you love to do that maybe most people don't know about?
I have to say I do work a lot, but I love to, we have a lap pool up there, and it's solar heated. And so I've been really loving swimming. One of my patients, unfortunately now long gone, had told me about, I used to hate swimming, and you would turn your head and all the water would go near. So she told me about the swim snorkel, and that has changed my life. So I love, swimming, and I've been doing, with the weather's okay, I swim on the weekend as much as I can, and do laps. And so I've liked that a lot. And that's a good thing as you age and you realize that when you ran all that cross-country track, it really probably did damage your knees. So I think that's a good thing. And I've never been a big, like make a fancy meal kind of person, but I like odd cooking. So I grow a lot of hot peppers, and I've been making, pickled hot peppers, and I grind hot peppers and make hot pepper powder and different kinds. It's really fun. And we've learned a lot of different ways of, we grew these big squash, which are fascinating, these big round green squash, and made curry soup. And I made curry soup because my nurse practitioner's mother, who's Indian, told me about making curried squash soup. And so then, because it was an Indian soup, I brought one to a patient of mine who's also a colleague, and who's Indian, and they were so excited beyond belief. So you realize that you can grow things, and you can actually give gifts to people that you just grow in the garden. So that's been a lot of fun. And then a little side thing that I like to do is read crummy mysteries, and it's really funny. I'm part of a book club now, reading virtually, and I miss it a fair bit, but of women doctors, all around my age, and really a lot of serious books, right? But what I really like to do is read these, historical mysteries. And so I read them on my iPad. And that's a lot of fun, since I often read them in the middle of the night. So
it's a good escape too. Wow. Okay. Okay. Well, those are good things that we we got to know a little about. And you mentioned your husband and kids. So what do they do? Where are they? I know your daughter was in China when all of this broke loose, and so that's a story in its own. But tell us a little bit about family life now.
Well, you know, my son works in LA in digital media, and the COVID has given him a little time. He was working on a company with a partner, and you know, just a lot of financial issues with the COVID. And even before, I think that it was a really difficult life of uncertainty. I certainly wouldn't be able to tolerate in terms of financial uncertainty and work coming in. So he's really been rethinking where he wants to work and looking at getting a regular job and focusing a little bit differently. So we're excited for him in that. He works in LA. He's a couple projects he's working on now, and they've worked with the Cartoon Network and other things. I mean, it's amazing what you can do with digital animation and how little you make for it. But
Yeah.
I mean, they can do a lot of work and not make a lot of money. But my daughter, who's the younger one, they both graduated from UCLA. She'd worked for a year and gotten this fabulous fellowship in Shanghai and was there. And, you know, Chinese New Year came and there was a little bit of COVID, but not much. And she went to Vietnam with a backpack. And I said to her, being mom, are you sure you only want to bring a backpack? Don't you want to bring a rollie with a little more things? What if you need more things? Anyway, of course, she went with the backpack. And while she was in Vietnam, everything fell apart. And I got her out with one of the last flights back, but she came through Hong Kong. So she never went back to Shanghai to pick up her things. The program was canceled. Everything was done. So we're actually just now working with some people I work with in Shanghai on medical education to try and get her things shipped back, because the school left it in there, then they collected and put it in an office, and then I asked for these people to bring it to their office, which they very kindly did. So we're now just getting it back. And my daughter's kept up with her Chinese, and she's now decided she wants to go to law school and do education policy. So she's working on that. And my husband is in high tech, has a PhD in material sciences, and has been working from home, which has been fascinating also. And he's the vintner. We have a tiny hobby vineyard. He makes the wine. He made port, although it's not really port because we aren't in Porto, last year, and loves to be in the outdoors. So.
Oh, amazing. I love that. Well, I'm so glad that you got her out. My goodness, what a time.
Well, eventually she would have gotten out, but it was pretty amazing because it felt very funny. I remember I was at a meeting and, it's kind of like United was just like the flights were dropping off every day. So I kept booking her and then the flights got canceled, so I think I rebooked her 4 times.
Oh my goodness. Well, as we get to the close, we've got about 7-8 more minutes, but I wanted to talk with you about travel. You love traveling. I feel like every time I am talking with your admin, I'm trying to find dates because you're off teaching here and there and everywhere. What do you miss most? Where do you miss most going?
I don't know. I find, sort of beauty and value in, almost everywhere I go. I think, I really do. I think there's really interesting things to learn about everywhere. And, a lot of the meetings you go to are a day in and out, so you might eat a nice meal or something, but in terms of, travel and visiting, that's sort of a different question. But I don't know that I really have, there are magic trips where you took a couple of extra days and brought your daughter or son or whatever it is. And I know you have those experiences too. But for work-wise, I think that, I can't say that I have a favorite place or a favorite work trip. I think that the meetings that you go to like that are just a great opportunity to work with colleagues and maybe to learn a little bit about another culture, another place, but to learn a lot more. And so for me, those always have been really exciting as long as you, make a balance between being at home and getting your work done and traveling. So I think that's really, otherwise I think I've never been one to have one favorite anyway. So I appreciate all sorts of different aspects of things.
And are there places that you have on a bucket list that you'd like to visit that you haven't yet?
There are places I would go back to for holidays. I mean, we used to spend some time in the summer with a colleague and his family in Greece, and we all really loved going out to the islands of Greece. But, there's some places I haven't brought my family that I'd like to, like, traveling around Vietnam. It might be fun to go to Bhutan someday. I don't know that we ever will, but it would be fun. Places like that. I think there's a lot of beautiful places to see in nature, like the Galapagos, et cetera. Tierra del Fuego, I haven't been to because, there would never have been a work trip and it takes a long time to go there. One trip that we did, which was amazing and had nothing to do with work, and you don't even have a presence as a physician, was going to see the Soyuz launch when my husband's college roommate's wife, Peggy Whitson, was the commander of the space shuttle then and the space station for the US. And they went up in Soyuz. So we went to Moscow and Kazakhstan as their guests and with several group of different Americans and then the whole French European Space Agency. And that was an amazing experience. So I think, that taught me that you should never say no to adventure. We're like, oh no, we can't take 2 weeks off. And then we went and it was incredible. So I want to say, I just want to make a comment. I know because we're getting towards the end of the hour, but I have to say that I've been really, really impressed by the way you and your company have managed COVID. It's really been amazing to see. And I think that it's important for the viewers to know that too. I mean, they know that the way medical education survives is through getting financial support from pharmaceutical companies. But in this time, it's been really difficult. And what I've seen is that you've reached into, your own resources and done programs to benefit physicians, nurse practitioners of all kinds, and patients without having that financial base. And because people are so grateful to you, I think that, those of us who've worked with you, you've had an amazing, group of people supporting you also through that. But I think it's your energy and support and that of your team that really makes that such an incredible resource. And I want to thank you also for that.
Oh, thank you for saying that. It's definitely been a time. It was so uncertain for so long. And we started thinking, we were watching these other companies, like uniform companies start making masks, or, flower companies start planting different things to kind of serve their communities. And we thought, well, we've got a platform and we love education and we've got people, like you, like these fabulous thought leaders that if we asked for favors at this time, we could still deliver quality information and quality education. And I have to say, doing things like this, the podcast, we did a social media pop-up CME where, there was no funding, but nobody asked for honorarium. And we made the first ever Twitter-based CME. And it was really just, when you think about it, it's just your time. It's like, well, if I have the time and this is my passion, I'm going to do it. So I appreciate you saying that because I know my team has worked really, they've worked without knowing what the future holds. And I think that that's hard, especially, they're all such young, creative, powerful women. It's just been it's honored me to see how they've just kind of doubled down and said, we're here, like we're going to do it. So I appreciate you saying that because it really means a lot to me, and I know to my team as well.
There's been a couple of other medical education companies that have done this, but it's been really, really encouraging, and I think inspiring to see that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, on that note, Hope, I've loved spending this time with you. I know that the listeners have a clearer view of who you are behind that white coat. I thank you so much for all your contributions. This year's ASCO was exciting on so many levels. Your work was exciting. And I look forward to what's next. We keep pushing and we keep creating and we keep giving of ourselves in this time, and wonderful, beautiful things are coming out of it. So I can't wait to see when we all do get back to being able to be around each other, an SABCS or next year's ASCO or something. just the first time we can be together, I can't wait for all the, that energy, that connection, because like you said earlier, there is something very special about learning from each other when you're in the same room and, just listening on a different level than when you're in front of a screen. So I do look forward to seeing everyone again. And I thank you for your time for this. If there's anything ever that we can do for you, please let us know. And until we see you again, I wish you health and happiness. And I look forward to the time where we do see each other in person.
Indeed, me too. And thank you for doing this. And thank you for inviting me to do it also. It was really an honor.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, good night to you.
Good night.